Hello again. We are continuing our readings from the book What is Man? Adam, Alien or Ape? And we're continuing in chapter 1, and we're beginning to look now at the idea that man is simply a superior simian, or in the terminology I'm using, that man is made in the image of the apes. And that is the subheading of our reading where we begin. Image of the apes. Under this heading, we need to consider two distinct themes that underlie what Raymond Tallis calls aping mankind, of which more later. There is, of course, the familiar biological narrative of neo-Darwinism, neo-Darwinian evolution. But this is only one side of the coin. The other side, less obvious but probably more powerful, is a philosophical narrative called positivism, which claims that, and I quote here, all knowledge is ultimately based on sense experience, close quote. Why does this matter? Because the biological story, nourished by this hidden philosophical stream, proudly proclaims itself to be the only show in town. It isn't, of course, as this book seeks to demonstrate. But positivism's total denial of God, metaphysics, spirituality, and the soul dominates 21st century Western thought to an amazing degree. Even if your eyes glaze over at the very mention of the word philosophy, be warned. Your understanding of both yourself and the world around you is almost certainly affected by positivistic thinking. Here in chapter 1, we'll do little more than identify this hidden stream, because it will become a major topic later in the book when we consider the mind and consciousness of man. But let me give one or two recent examples to whet or perhaps spoil your appetite. In their 2010 book, The Grand Design, famous cosmologist, the late Stephen Hawking, and his co-author rename this philosophy scientific determinism and explain, quotes, "This book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies that there are no miracles or exceptions to the laws of nature," close quotes. The laws of nature are, of course, derived exclusively from our physical observations of the natural world around us, observations that are ultimately recorded by our physical senses and aided, where necessary, by instruments like microscopes, telescopes, and so on. A second example is the search for extraterrestrial life that often hits the headlines in the popular press. We shall examine this in depth in chapter 3 and see that the whole hugely expensive enterprise is based on the idea that life and intelligence have arisen on earth by natural processes and must therefore exist or have existed on a multitude of Earth-like planets throughout the universe. Any suggestion of creation by God is rigorously excluded, not by the science involved, but by the underlying positivist philosophy. So, more of that later. Let us now consider the biological narrative. Subheading: Biology after Darwin. In the book The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin traced man's origin back to ape-like ancestors and beyond, believing that all living things, the whole biosphere, originated from a single primal organism, an idea often called common descent. His original theory, published in his famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, that's all the title of the book, has of course been significantly elaborated over the years into neo-Darwinism, the so-called modern synthesis, which incorporates genetic evolution. Briefly stated, the theory claims that organisms evolve by a dual process consisting of 1. Random genetic mutations, that's changes in the organism's DNA produced by a variety of causes, followed by 2. Natural selection of those members of a population to which mutations have imparted superior reproductive capacity. Although it is admitted that genetic mutations are overwhelmingly damaging or neutral in their effect, it is held that favorable mutations, that is, those that improve reproductive success, do occasionally take place. These beneficial mutations then spread through the population because their owners reproduce more successfully than others. One seldom mentioned problem with this scenario, as it is applied to mankind, is that if it is true, humans are seriously over-evolved. That is, we have acquired characteristics that far exceed any conceivable value in increasing our reproductive capacity. According to the neo-Darwinian narrative, no capacity should arise in an organism that does not improve its ability to reproduce. But humans possess powers that flatly contradict this. An interesting example was reported in the London Times newspaper, article called "Think Big. Your brain can store 4.7 billion books," close quote. Terry Sejanovsky, a professor of computational neurology at the Salk Institute in California, has found that the part of the brain that deals with memory has a capacity 10 times bigger than previously thought, and could store data roughly equivalent to the entire contents of the World Wide Web. He states, quote, "Our new measurements of the brain's memory capacity increase conservative estimates by a factor of 10 to at least a petabyte, in the same ballpark as the World Wide Web. We discovered the key to unlocking the design principle for how hippocampal neurons function with low energy but high computational power. Close quote. If we could use this enormous memory storage capacity, of course, it could be interpreted as the outcome of survival value, Darwinism. But we can't. We regularly forget the names of acquaintances and where we put the car keys, and I doubt whether many of us could memorize even one book, let alone 4.7 billion. In other words, we have failed to evolve any means of accessing this huge potential memory capacity, which therefore can do nothing to help us reproduce. So why do we possess these potential powers of memory? Why have they allegedly evolved? No naturalistic theory of evolution can answer this question. I might add that there are many other human characteristics that have no plausible reproductive value, such as the ability to handle and enjoy musical, aesthetic, philosophical, and mathematical concepts. Humble bacteria reproduce far more efficiently than human beings. Subheading: Doubting Darwinism. I devoted several chapters in my book, Who Made God, to a step-by-step critique of evolutionary mechanisms, and will not repeat it here. However, the conclusion was that although Darwinian processes can and do produce minor changes in the characteristics of populations, it is incapable of creating the major changes required to transform one kind of creature into another, macroevolution. Evidence from centuries of artificial selection by human intervention, as practiced by plant and animal breeders, supports this conclusion. While many new varieties and breeds of, say, cats or dogs have been generated, artificial selection never produces new kinds of organism, like breeding bears from cats or goats from dogs. There are natural barriers to macroevolution that no amount of human ingenuity can overcome. Some of these barriers may well be surmounted in due course using genetic engineering, in which scientists deliberately edit the DNA of an organism to produce, for example, disease-resistant crops or bacteria that manufacture medically useful compounds. But genetic engineering requires the skilled and purposeful manipulation of organisms by intelligent human agents. It doesn't happen by chance or accident. Furthermore, the emergence of the hypothetical first living organism from non-living starting material is a process often called chemical evolution, and is today commonly attributed to fortuitous but entirely undirected physical and chemical processes, which are as yet unknown. Such undirected processes have never been observed in the laboratory and are never likely to be observed, in spite of decades of effort by origin of life researchers. It is true that artificial life of a kind has been created by chemists such as Craig Venter, using sophisticated techniques to imitate the DNA found in nature. But this has only been achieved under the most precise control and direction of skilled scientists. The creation of artificial life forms, if achieved, will not occur without the careful direction of highly intelligent people, never by undirected natural processes. Though technically not part of neo-Darwinism, the theory of chemical evolution completes the picture for the evolutionist by reducing the origin and development of life, and thus of man, to purely natural processes accessible to scientific study. Most people today assume that Darwin's, quote, scientific account of human origins must be right, and the Bible's religious teaching must be wrong, or at least, at best, mythological. Man is not God's creation, we are told, but simply an animal that happened to have climbed further up the tree of evolution. Like every other form of life, he is an accident of evolution. But the urgent and ongoing search for missing links between apes and man, considered later, bears witness to the huge biological, intellectual, and existential gap that separates humans from our closest supposed relatives, such as chimpanzees. A criticism of common descent is not tolerated in educational establishments, in spite of its gaping scientific inadequacies, and the fact that many well-qualified scientists reject it. Alternatives to Darwinism are vigorously suppressed, not least in Western nations like the UK, where the teaching of evolutionary theory is mandated in schools, and creationism is effectively banned and ridiculed by the establishment and the mass media. This unwillingness to allow an open public debate of evolutionary theory is rather curious, given that its proponents claim to have overwhelming scientific evidence in their favor. We shall develop this debate later, but here's a final thought. In spite of the adulation heaped upon it, Darwinism makes virtually no contribution to modern biological research. Those are not my words. Philip Skell, Emeritus Evan Pugh Professor in Pennsylvania State University and a member of the USA's National Academy of Sciences, writes, quote, "The modern form of Darwin's theory has been raised to its present high status because it's said to be the cornerstone of modern experimental biology. But is that correct? While the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Theodosius Dobzhansky's dictum that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, most experimental biologists can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas." Professor Skell also points out that A.S. Wilkins, editor of the Journal of Bioessays, wrote in 2000, quote, "Evolution would appear to be the indispensable unifying idea, and at the same time a highly superfluous one." Close quote. Well, there we leave our second reading from the book, and next time we shall be looking at another idea of the origin of man, the emergent spirit concept, in which an evolved animal suddenly and mysteriously acquired a spirit, the abilities to think and consider and plan that are not found in animals or any living thing apart from man himself.